Hey, how's it going? Andy Peliquin here with the latest panel, Sex in Fantasy, Yes or No, with me are these awesome panelists. Shai, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Cherise Clayton. I write a lot of different things. I'm a career ghostwriter, so I can't actually say a lot of different things. I do have an Amazon under Cherise Clayton where I've written a few books. Mostly I do space opera and some zombie stuff.
Awesome.
And I have a time lag, so
EJ, over to you.
Oh, good. Hi, I'm EJ Buenatrova, or EJ No Name, according to my my little Zoom thing there. That's all good. Last name is too long anyway. I am a officially published author now. Hooray! So I have one book out with an indie publisher. I've got another one coming right up. I've written contemporary sci-fi fantasy. I love fantasy.
Seems like we're having some technical difficulties. That's going to be quite a fun thing.
it's like doing a Mars colony. We have that.
Are you back, EJ?
I am back. Was I frozen? You guys were frozen.
Yeah, you were frozen. We're going to say it's your fault.
Was I frozen like this?
Yeah, it was a pretty funny thing. All right. So the topic today is sex and fantasy. Now, I came up with this topic because I was reading some, I'm going to say paranormal romance as fantasy, but that's a little bit sacrilegious for me. I was reading this book and there was sex scenes in it, and I was trying to think about all of my favorite fantasy books. Brandon Sanderson, Scott Lynch, Joe Abercrombie, and there are no sex scenes in them. Do you guys have any awesome fantasy books that have sex scenes?
I have to beg to differ. Joe Abercrombie had a pretty intense sex scene there.
Where? Which one?
Okay, wait. Blanking. It was, I last read them a few years ago, and it was the dude who was hiding with no name and no face, and there was the kind of wild woman. Look, I have two small children. The memory is not a thing, okay? There was a guy doing the stuff with the girl, and they got it on.
Right. Was it like the one
that, ooh, ah, oh, it was one of the most horrendously written sex scenes ever. It was great.
Okay. And it was one of those published novels, the Heroes or the Red Country or whatever. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I think if you're going to write sex and fantasy, writing literally ooh, ah, oh, whoa, that was awesome. Well done. Joe
Interesting.
Well done. Shai, do you want to go first on some faves that you've got?
I don't know that I have any off the top of my hand. I didn't know I needed notes. I think that a lot of times we're losing the break between stuff that's calling itself erotica, science fiction, fantasy, paranormal romance, and the stuff that's just actually softcore porn. I ghostwrite the softcore porn. I am available for hire, but they're not the same thing.
Dude, you just became a robot to me. Did that happen with everybody?
That's awesome. Everybody's freezing for me. And frozen. I'm here.
Okay. This is going to be a great panel. A lot of freezing in the middle of sentences. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, Shai totally just got like a total robot voice on my end in the middle of talking. It was fantastic. Very appropriate. Are we going to talk cyborg sex? Because that's a good topic.
Okay, let's hear it.
That's my next book. Surviving the Transhuman Mechaphilia Riots.
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, cyborg sex.
Okay. So you like this blur? I heard before you turned into a robot, I heard you saying that you like this blurring of definitions. Is that correct?
No. Oh. I don't like the blurring of definitions. I think that we are getting a blurring of definitions. But what is traditional fantasy and what is just basically softcore porn are not the same thing. And people are grouping them all into the same window and going, why is there sex in my book? Or there's not enough sex in my book. We need to pull them apart again.
That's true. I think a lot of the best fantasy, again, the fantasy that I've read, a lot of it is written by men. So I'm sure there's a lot of fantasy written by women, by that have good great sex scenes, but the fantasy that I've read, there are no sex scenes that I can remember, at least.
Are you a page skimmer when it comes to too much description?
I am, and I am not. I am both sometimes. When it comes to, like, I just started reading these Safehold novels. It's sci-fi meets fantasy meets historical fiction. And the intro was like a solid chapter of just talking about the politics of the world. And I couldn't read it because I wasn't invested in the characters yet. Whereas when I'm already invested in the characters and the story, then I'll read the description. But for the most part, I sometimes have to skim.
Now, wait a minute. So Shai, what side of the issues are we coming down on here? Are we both coming down on the same side? Because that's going to make for a mighty boring debate. Should I switch sides? That sounded naughty.
I can argue on either side as well. I like the division because I don't like bad reviews based on I didn't know it was there. And a lot of writers I'm watching are getting bad reviews because people don't know what's in the book. And it's frozen again.
So there's sex scenes in the book?
You're almost back.
Still frozen.
I heard Andy for a second there.
Yeah, no, I cut off because I thought someone was talking. So there are sex scenes in the book, and then the book gets a bad review because people are like, what? I didn't want that.
Yeah, that happens quite a lot. It's the same with zombie books where somebody will give a bad review on the zombie book because they didn't realize there'd be violence in it. Oh, my.
Yeah.
I gotta take a bit of issue with that. So I'm just curious. So Shai, do you like having sex scenes in fantasy books if they're included appropriately?
I like anything that's well written. That's my personal reading style. If it's well written, I'll read it. If it's written by a 34-year-old basement-dwelling, non-sexually active individual's imaginations, I skim it. It doesn't get read. The book probably won't get finished. So I'm on both sides.
Interesting. So sounds like Shai and I can both go both ways, which, you know, I have to make as many double entendres here as I possibly can. You know that, right, Andy?
Absolutely.
You did actually invite me to this panel.
Absolutely, specifically for this panel.
Yeah, okay, so here's my issue. I have read, you know, the classics. I've read the Tolkien, you know, I've read the sort of Shannara, Robert Jordan, right?
Yeah.
None of these guys, they're all men, and none of these guys have sex scenes. Very few of them even allude to activity. So that's, I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, that is, I think, what fantasy readers have sort of come to expect. Now, is that a sort of a, like, playing to the asexual patriarchy of the sci-fi fantasy community? Perhaps. And yeah, there are times when I've read books, some of the more modern sci-fi fantasy, where these kind of graphic sex scenes seem to come out of nowhere. And I'm thrown for a loop, and I'm just kind of like, wasn't expecting that. There was somebody, and I'm, you know, again, two small children, very little sleep. Somebody wrote a series, had some aeronauts, and I want to say it was not Jim Butcher. I don't believe. I might have been a female author. Anyway, there were these two characters that just had crazy wild sex all over the place, like crazy wild soap opera sex, up one side and down the other. It wasn't graphic, but it was, you know, it was pretty romance novel. It was pretty bodice ripping, pretty romance novel inspired. Is that ringing a bell to anybody?
Yeah, it sounds really familiar.
Yeah, and yet I'm blanking on it. But for some reason, that kind of turned me off of the whole series. Maybe my issue is that what I've seen from sex being described in sci-fi fantasy is that it takes on as science fiction and as fantastical an aspect as the rest of the story, and that throws me out of reality. It seems like, because, you know, we have this sort of classic hero type of story often happening in sci-fi fantasy, these characters are having like superhumanly good sex all the time. and that does not work for me at all. You know, I'm not going to argue against sex in writing, but I'm like, you know, these guys are on journeys. They're dirty. They're tired. They've just fought a horde of zombies. They're covered in like rotting flesh scum, and they still like can't keep their hands off each other. I want to read. I may have to write the fantasy book in which the characters get a little bit randy, and then they're like, "Man, I'm sorry, you stink. I can't do it. I just can't," and they fall asleep because a little bit of realism would go a long way.
Yeah, it's true. You have these heroes having these epic sex scenes after a 2-day battle, and it's like, no, number one, you're sweaty and gross, and number two, you're exhausted.
Yeah.
So
and number three, infections, because cleanliness is an issue.
Awesome.
I really feel like we have the makings of an amazing anti-erotica novel going on right here.
Okay, and let's go into the erotica on this.
Okay.
I have one literary review. They did a nice literary review, said that I'm really good, blah, 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 blah. It's really awesome. And they compared me to dino porn as because I have sex in my zombie book. And I'm small press. I'm not big name.
Yeah.
And I just was reading that going, no, I ghostwrite that kind of stuff. Because those sex scenes that you see in the middle of a book out of nowhere, I will get contracts from agents on behalf of their writers that say, he needs 12,000 more words. Can you put in a couple of sex scenes? He needs 12,000 more words. Can you beef up the dialogue? And that's where those sex scenes come from, is ghostwriters who take a manuscript that's already written and just throw in 5 sex scenes. For $50. I'm available.
I was gonna say, sweet, I want that job. It sounds awesome. Huh.
Half the time they don't pay, so it's not as awesome as it sounds.
Okay, hold up. I'm gonna have to jump the fence a little bit here. So, here's the other thing, though, right? So I will admit, I have an upcoming book for publication that has a pretty intense sex scene in it, and it's gonna keep on that way. And I will defend that up one side and down the other. And it's already thrown a few people for a loop. A few of my betas that have read it are kind of like, what? My mom was psyched. She was like, that was awesome. She's a romance reader. To me, it makes sense because these two characters are very broken individuals. One of them is a rape survivor. One of them is watched his lover horrendously murdered right in front of him. So wanting to write about the intensity of their dysfunction, which includes this very mistrustful sexual relationship with each other, was pretty important to me. It had a pretty rock solid plot reason. That being said, I'm still a female writer, and I have a feeling I'm still going to get dissed for that a little bit, especially among the more traditional, sorry Andy, male, a little more patriarchal, fantasy sci-fi writers out there. But I maintain it's appropriate. It's a little bit spicy. And all right, it's a lot spicy. It's pretty intense. And it makes sense where it occurs. So yeah. I think you read it. Andy.
I did read that scene, and I was beat red. No, I'm kidding. It was it was well written. I think my main issue with a lot of the sex and fantasy is that, like Shai was saying earlier, authors kind of forget that they're writing fantasy and they're not writing romantic fantasy or erotic fantasy There's so many genres. Every genre you tack romance onto it and it's there. Historical romance, contemporary romance, sci-fi romance, and good fantasy focuses so much more on the characters and on the world and on the magic and the fantastical elements that often I feel that when you have romance in it, it brings it out of the fantastical world and makes it more like contemporary. Someone gave me a review of Blade of the Destroyer, the book, and they said every time the hunter said fuck, it brought them out of the fantastical world that I built and brought them back to their own life, because it's a commonly used word in modern things. So all of the sex that's going on in fantasy, it takes them out of the fantasy setting. The romance between the knight, no knights, no ladies in modern times. So the romance between them, that's something fantastical, sure. But as soon as they get down to the nitty gritty of having sex, it's as real as it is for them and their wife, them and their husband, etc. So it almost drags you out of the world and brings you back to real life. Or at least that's how I find it for me.
Okay, at the same time, when we're in a book that's got super detailed descriptions of pretty much everything else, especially I would point out, for example, the hunter. She's got some, I mean, pretty much every time the hunter fights, that's like having sex. There's knives plunging in and out and in and out. And there's incredibly detailed descriptions of the intensity and the rushing sensations mounting inside him. How come we don't get that level of detail with his sexual relationships? How can we get that kind of violence but not sex?
That's a good question. When I sat down to write that scene, I didn't feel like the sexual details added to the story of the hunter. Like the way he views sex, especially with that character, was very much like a physical need as opposed to something that he enjoyed. And so I wrote the scene and someone said, that just sounds like the most clinical, detached thing ever. And really that's what it was, because that was what it was for him. But it did make
sense in that particular instance. But I guess what I'm wondering is, where is this guy's sex life? We know he has it. We know he's just a little bit of a lech, and he gets super, sexual. He gets hypersexual after fighting and almost dying and healing. And I'm just kind of wondering, how does this character make love? Or have sex or fuck or anything in between? How does he do any of that? Because I know all these other things really intimately about his personality, and that one is like behind closed doors. Nothing else about his life is behind closed doors. I feel like I've been very intimate with this guy, but he's kind of like a tease. I don't know. I can't figure out what he's all about. So what's going on there? I mean, it seems like there's something missing.
Can I interject?
Of course.
Heinlein spoke to that with the natural response to death or almost dying is sex. But if you're going to write sex, have a woman read it. Because when a man writes sex, when a male writer writes sex, they almost always get told they're too clinical, they're too analytical, they're too manipulative, it's not sympathetic to the reader. And when a woman writes it or a woman editor works with the man, then it comes into the realm where we identify with it and we think that it's okay. And this is me and my psychology background stepping in. A lot of male writers I know do not like to commit to a sex scene because they don't want the women in their life to know how they, quote unquote, feel about sex from their characters, and they hold themselves back on that. That's what I see.
I like that. That's so devious subconsciously of us men.
Yeah.
Pussy. Oops. Are we on the no swearing? No, we're not. We're already swearing.
Oh, absolutely. Swearing is welcome.
I totally see that. That actually makes a great deal of psychological sense, Shai. I definitely see why that is. And I mean, I do think that women write sex scenes very well, possibly a little better than men. It's hard to make a blanket gender statement like that. I have read some women fantasy writers who do not include sex in their novels, and they're fantastic. Elizabeth Hand, Dita Paxonarian.
Yeah,
series.
Moon.
Yep. Or Elizabeth Moon. Yeah, Elizabeth Hand, Elizabeth Moon, Elizabeth Bell, Boone. I don't know. They're two excellent female sci-fi fantasy writers. But at the same time, do we want to, this is getting into tricky gender territory, do we want to be lumped in as, women sci-fi fantasy writers, they're always just, semi-erotica, tossing sex into their novels?
Do we want to default the Heinlein's women write sex, men don't?
Yeah.
Paradigm? No, we don't. But can you name a single male character who wrote a romantic relationship in sci-fi or fantasy that worked, let alone sexual relationship that works?
Well, I think there's a lot of really good romantic relationships in sci-fi and fantasy. David Weber, he wrote some great ones in his fantasy series, the War God Zone. I think it was David Weber. And
I don't read him.
Oh,
I don't read him either.
I think relationships are much easier to write, especially for men. They just basically have to say, okay, what would I not do in this situation, and then they write that,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I really don't like the idea of men kind of hiding behind this thing of, I don't want to let out this part of myself, so I'm gonna shy away from this whole aspect, and I gotta say, I think there's a pretty strong vein of that going on. I really, really do. And I really think that, if anything, I will probably, I don't know, get a sex change and continue to write as a male sci-fi fantasy author, specifically with lots of racy sex scenes, just to overturn that, because I am so bored with it. Yours is not the first book, Andy, that I've started to read and suddenly gone, why do we keep coming up to the edge of this big, like, black hole, and then the black curtain goes down? You know, like, why don't I get to know what's going on there when every other aspect, with the possible exception of bodily elimination process, another thing we might need to actually write about someday in books, because it's never ever written about, and we know it's happened. What are all these people on the trail using for toilet paper? Seriously? I mean, I've been wondering this for years.
Leaves.
I guess. It is one of they've got to get poison ivy or poison oak or some sci-fi fantasy equivalent of that sooner or later. And that's another good reason why they can't get it on the trail. So somebody's going to have to write about that someday. I'm just saying there's a level of intimacy that I think that we might be missing with our sci-fi fantasy characters. And I'm concerned that by not including sex scenes and not getting to know that part of them, we're just kind of perpetuating this stereotype, this sort of, male nerd stereotype of sci-fi fantasy. And I think it's just time to turn that right over and get rid of it.
I like it. Well said. I mean, like, I know in a lot of the fantasy that I've read and the fantasy that I write, relationships and romance and those kind of things do play a very important part of the story, because they really are a very important part of literally every story. Everyone is looking for love. Everyone is looking for romance. Everyone is looking for that someone special in their life. In one story that I'm writing, it's the girl, she has a horrible experience. She gets raped, and so she closes herself off to love completely. And because the person who raped her was a man, she immediately treats men with that respect. So when she finds someone who she can trust and love, the fact that it's a woman doesn't mean anything to her. It's just that she's finally finding someone to open herself up to. It has nothing to do with the gender.
And yet that's a bit of a trope.
Okay.
Wrong phrase. That's a bit of normal in the counseling world, that there's that 10% of women who switch sides because of rape that nobody likes to talk about. So you may get some pushback on that. I don't know.
The idea wasn't to connect those two elements, to connect the horrible sexual abuse with the thing. It was more to make it that essence of love is love, no matter where it comes from. It could be anyone. And so the gender element of it doesn't come into play beyond the fact that I know a lot of rape victims, they tend to be very hesitant around men. I say men because a large percentage of rape victims are women. They're scared around men, whereas around other women, they're more willing to let their guard down. So that change, that ease around someone else is much more natural with some same gender, and so with that, being able to let your guard down makes it more possible.
It's an interesting character reason, when you get that specific with it. So my question is, are we going to get to see these two characters have sex?
That is an interesting question, and I still don't know, because I haven't written that book yet.
Well, the reason why I'm asking is because if we want to know about that character and how she overcomes her hesitation towards sexual activity, part of it is going to be overcome automatically, perhaps because she's with a person of the same gender, maybe for the first time, and she doesn't have that immediate sense of threat. But there's some very interesting psychological territory. How does a person like that come out of their shell and become sexually active again? So I would say that calls for a sex scene, at least part of one, or something tastefully written. I mean, that's a question in my mind right off the bat. How's this woman going to do that? So inquiring minds want to know, right?
Yeah, me too. I'm really curious.
So I'm reminded of Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover series. I know the author herself is not that appreciated right now, but the series addressed how people interact with sexuality and their own sexuality and surviving and moving forward, book after book after book after book. That's something I think that in the future I'll be pointing people to more after the caveat about Marion Zimmer Bradley herself.
Interesting.
Apparently the books aren't familiar.
No, I'm a little bit, well, no, it made me start to think of other authors and try to rack my brain for other authors and you know, kind of go back through all the sci-fi fantasy I've read. And you know what, we didn't study for this pop quiz. Yeah. Man, I should have had like all these things right at my fingertip, but then I have, you know, zero retention at this time. So that's not going to work anyway. But I'm pretty sure that we're talking about an epidemic here in sci-fi fantasy in general, an epidemic of lack of sexuality in general. And it's a little weird. I understand that on the one hand, we don't want to immediately flip all the way over into the, you know, erotica or softcore genre to the point where we're in straight up paranormal romance. On the other hand, I get really irritated with genre pigeonholing. This is a big problem for me because I have trouble sticking to a genre. I keep writing different things in different genres and nobody knows what the hell to do with me or how to market me, and I've tried writing under pen names and that's not working, and you know, I don't know, I just feel like, why can't I just be the writer that I'm going to be and write about all the things that I want to write about, and I'm not going to wimp out and I'm not going to shy away from certain things because they're not normally included in said genre. In fact, Andy, you may notice that in that draft of my upcoming, not exactly epic fantasy, but more character-driven fantasy book, I'm kind of trying to bust as many of those stereotypes as I can, and I know I'm going to be pissing people off. I pissed off one of my betas so bad with my stereotype-breaking sci-fi fantasy book that he basically ripped it a new one royally. Kind of made me want to walk away from writing altogether. It was really brutal.
Wow.
And I think part of that, he didn't specifically call it out, but I do think a big part of that was the sex scene and the amount of time devoted to sort of the relationship between these two characters. The book is about relationships. It's taking place in a world that isn't ours, but it's not a very otherworldly world. It's a little more fantasy than sci-fi. There's not going to be endless tech descriptions. There's not going to be endless descriptions of walking across landscapes or multi-page descriptions of what's in the larder, like George R.R. Martin did there at that time. Although, there's an interesting example, not so much in Game of Thrones series there, but in the Wild Cards.
Okay, yeah.
Wild Cards now, yes. There's some pretty racy sex in Wild Cards.
Okay.
Not familiar with it. Can I take a step back from your point?
Uh-huh.
We need to work more on marketing, because you made a comment that you want to go from genre to genre to genre, and you're not going to be pigeonholed. Think of all the great writers that we have that have 50 books out. They've been around forever. They went from genre to genre to genre, because we talk about David Weber's fantasy series versus his space opera series. And the newer writers aren't being allowed that. We're being told to stay in one genre instead of body of work. And I have people who will actually message me and say, well, I read your zombie stuff, I'll never read your space opera stuff. Or the opposite. I'm reading your space opera, I'll never read your zombie. It's like, you're not supposed to. They're two different markets. They're two different audiences. I'm not, that's not what I'm looking for. We need to work harder at identifying this is in this and this is in that. So this is my romancy space opera, and yes, there is romance, and yes, it ends on a kiss. The whole routine. This is my zombies, and it's pretty damn hardcore, and her partner's going to get shot in the head in the next episode. We have to separate.
We have to separate. Why do we? This was not supposed to be a genre argument, but I kind of dig it. Why do we have to separate? Why do we have to keep them separated, as they say?
Because I gave my space opera next novel to one of my readers, and she returned it with, "You have too many characters."
Well, was that your problem as a writer?
She's paranormal. No, she's paranormal romance. It's all she does. Paranormal romance only has 5 characters. Space opera hubs, planets, and timelines, and 50,000 characters, and the ships are characters, and it's more complex.
I don't know about this. I don't know if I like these guidelines. So you're clearly very much a pro writer, and you've been in this marketing business for a while, and this is probably why you're going to sell books and make money as a ghostwriter, and I'm not so much. But I don't know if I like that. I don't know if I like this said genre has to have said rules. I think that is, let's look at it this way. What about Shai? What if somebody starts to read your stuff, right? And they just freaking love you as a writer. And all of a sudden they find themselves broadening their horizons and they want to go out and they want to read your space opera, even though they've been a diehard zombie disemboweler fan prior to that. That's exciting. I mean, isn't that why we became writers, to help people broaden their horizons?
Yes, but I don't want somebody picking up my Novello Low Res, which is LBGT space opera, and not knowing that it's LBGT space opera. Can you see what I'm saying?
Do we have to have some kind of a label?
I think we have to work on our descriptions. I think we have to work on our marketing. I think I want to be able to put a dinosaur on the cover of a space opera book and have it have sex in it and not be labeled dinosaur porn.
That would be space dinosaur porn.
Space dinosaur porn with zombies.
I'm trying to figure out what the pictorial version of that warning label would be like with the dinosaurs and the yeah.
I actually saw a picture today of two dinosaurs having sex. There was on 9gag, there was a question how two stegosauruses would have sex, and it actually showed it. And I thought it was hilarious.
Scary.
You know what? Broadening horizons.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
Broadening horizons. I don't know. I'm not sure. I may take some people off. I did take some people off with my first book, which, Andy, I don't think you actually read all the way through, but it's a book about a crazy florist. And there's also a lot of hypersexuality and a lot of violence. So one of my reviews was really pissed off that it wasn't a book on gardening. And what am I going to do? I mean, I described it up one side and down the other. When the publisher re-released it, his description is even more intense. And, some people are just going to run afoul of things that they didn't expect, and they're not going to be ready to have their horizons broadened. Does that mean that we should deliberately start to curtail our writing or our marketing to try to kowtow to those people? I don't know.
No, I think we need to be aware, though. I think we need to understand that there's a difference between a cozy romance and a cozy mystery. We have to label after it's written.
And then also on the part of the reader, maybe trying to remember, let's say we're going to stick with fantasy because that's what we're talking about. A fantasy book, first and foremost, is about people. Sure, there's magic, there's wizards, there's dragons, there's heroes, there's villains, whatever. But in the end, it's about people. It's about people doing people things in a completely different world, and yet there's so much about them that's relatable. So if there's sex in real life, which God hope there is.
I remember it vaguely.
Yeah. Pre-child number the second.
Yep.
If there is that element in our real life, then maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge it and say, no, it doesn't belong in fantasy because it's not what we were expecting. Like EJ has been saying, broaden your horizons. And I love that.
At the same time, I can also hop back easily to the other side, very easily, and say, yeah, I get really ticked off sometimes when I am reading a book and I'm in a certain frame of mind, and those sex scenes pop in and they are out of freaking left field. They're more intimately and accurately described than anything else that I've read prior to that. And I don't even understand. Sometimes they occur between people that I don't even know who they are or why they're having sex, because I might have fallen asleep a few pages ago. Man, it can get really tricky. And then, especially when it happens with female authors, every now and again, I literally start to cringe because I feel like I'm just going, did you have to go there? Did you have to play up to that stereotype again that all women sci-fi fantasy writers are just kind of bordering on paranormal romance? So there could be an argument for potentially just shying away from it, not giving into that temptation to just get our rocks off and write about it in quite such a detailed fashion. I have actually seen male sci-fi fantasy writers do that too, come to think of it. It's not just women.
I think it goes back to, if it's well written, it reads well, And if it's not well written, it's not going to read well, is I think the bottom line.
But then also relevance. For example, if Tolkien had a sex scene between Aragorn and Arwen, I feel like it would have been really out of place in the story that he wrote. Whereas if Brandon Sanderson or Robert Jordan's characters in The Wheel of Time, there was a graphic sex scene between certain characters where they're that in fact, I think there were even a couple of scenes that got a little spicy between
Brand and his
three girls.
Yeah.
So I guess if they're well written and they belong and they're relevant and they help the character development, then maybe there is something to be said for it. But if it's just shoehorned in there because sex sells, then the writer...
So take $50 to write 5 of them, right?
Yeah. Shoehorned into these 12,000 extra words.
There you go. Yeah, I think that can get really tricky. That can get tricky. And at the same time, when we are not describing other things so intimately, let's say your book isn't about graphic violence, and many fantasy books are not. Many of them shy away from that aspect. The more dark fantasy books. Don't you think you found, Andy, that dark fantasy books with a little more graphic violence tend to have a little more graphic sexuality as well?
I haven't read that much dark fantasy like demons and the gothic side of things. More grimdark, like Joe Abercrombie and Mark Lawrence.
You should read Jack Connor. Plug. One of my favorite authors. Awesome.
Okay.
I don't know. I felt that has happened a little bit.
It's frozen.
Am I frozen again? Am I back? Hello?
Yeah, you're there.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but I just feel like sometimes maybe we don't need to go all the way over the edge there. Sometimes maybe we just need to stop at spicy if everything else is going just right up to that edge. Maybe spicy is enough. Maybe implying is more powerful than going straight out.
I agree. Well, we've had a great discussion on sex and fantasy. We all agree that yes and no and maybe. So
I can argue both sides of this issue all day.
Absolutely. Check out.
Right.
Yeah, do it right. Check out the links of these awesome authors below. Have a great day.
Bye.